Welcome, learners, to the deep dive. Ever feel like global history is just a lot? Just this huge pile of names and dates, and you're not sure how it all connects. Imagine you've got like an hour before that massive exam, and what you really need is the big picture, right? The main developments, the connections, the aha moments. Well, that's exactly what we're doing today. We're diving into some key sources, basically a CRAM review, to pull out the absolute essentials for you, giving you that shortcut.
Exactly. And it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the why. Why did things happen? How did these huge shifts occur? We're looking at this condensed knowledge base, perfect for spotting patterns, tracing cause and effect, connecting those dots across time and space. We'll go through the different periods, highlighting the big changes, what stayed the same, and the really pivotal stuff that shaped the world we live in now.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into it. This deep dive should give you that essential map, focusing on how different places rose, how they interacted, and how new world orders came about. So get ready. We're hitting the key developments and transformations. Let's go.
All right, first up, 1200 to 1450. This is where distinct civilizations are really building their unique foundations, kind of setting the stage for everything that comes later. So what are the big stories here? How were states holding on to power, growing their influence?
Yeah, this unit, sometimes called the global tapestry, it really emphasizes comparing how states built and kept power. And a key theme, is how they borrowed ideas. They innovated, adapted things from older systems. It wasn't always invention, often adaptation. So for the big picture, you need to see both how unique these places were, but also how some of their ideas would eventually influence others way down the line.
Let's start with East Asia, China especially. They had these incredibly powerful, stable governments for like centuries. What was the secret sauce? How did they do it? Well, a huge piece was Confucianism. It created this really strong social hierarchy, emphasizing respect for elders' authority, filial piety. And then Neo-Confucianism came along, which kind of revitalized it, but also cleverly mixed in bits of Buddhism and Taoism, gave it more depth maybe. This philosophy was baked right into the government through the imperial bureaucracy. Massive system. And crucially, it was largely merit-based. You got in through the super tough civil service exam, so in theory at least you had qualified people running things. That justified the emperor's power and kept things efficient.
Okay, so this Chinese model was clearly working for them. Did neighbors just copy it, or was it more like picking and choosing?
Oh, definitely picking and choosing. That's a great question because it shows how culture actually spreads, right? Selective. Look at Korea. They had a tributary relationship, so yeah, they adopted the exams, Confucianism, often pushed by their own elites who saw the benefits. But interestingly, it sometimes led to stricter rules for women in Korea than in China, so a local spin on it. Japan, though, that's a classic case of voluntary and selective borrowing. They took the bureaucracy, Buddhism, writing, love those. But foot binding, nope, rejected that completely. Shows real cultural agency, choosing what fit their society. And Vietnam, even as a tributary state, adopting Confucian ideas, they kept stronger female roles. Women weren't pushed aside nearly as much as in China. So yeah, adaptation, not just adoption.
And Buddhism. You mentioned it got mixed into Neo-Confucianism. How did it fit in more broadly, especially when Confucianism was the official favorite?
All right, so Buddhism comes over from India, mainly via the Silk Roads. But it gets totally reshaped by local cultures in East Asia. It wasn't one monolithic thing. You had Theravada, more strict, monastic, often for the elites. Mahayana was way more accessible, focused on worshiping the Buddha, open to everyone. Tibetan Buddhism had its own unique mystical flavor. But in China, the really interesting one is Chan Buddhism, which you probably know as Zen. It's this cool blend of Mahayana ideas and local Taoist philosophy, focused on meditation, intuition. And even though Neo-Confucianism was the state's official thing, Chan Buddhism stayed super popular. Shows how different beliefs can coexist, find their own space.
So with all this structure and culture, what did it mean for China's wallet? How did they become such an economic powerhouse back then?
Oh, economically, China was way ahead in many ways, really significant economic developments. We see early signs of serious commercialization, a market economy, widespread use of paper money, credit systems, think flying money like early versions of checks, made trade way easier. They had large-scale iron and steel production, like proto-industrial levels, making tools, weapons, coins, and a huge boost came from champa rice, which they got from Vietnam. Game changer.
Oh, so
It was drought-resistant. You could get 2 harvests a year. Led to a massive population boom, tons more labor available. Plus, the Grand Canal expansion really boosted internal trade, connecting north and south. And innovations like the magnetic compass, better rudders, bulkheads for ships that supercharged sea trade. Chinese junks were dominant in the Indian Ocean. This early kind of proto-industrialization is fascinating, a real precursor to later stuff.
Okay, let's head west to Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world, another major powerhouse of culture and trade. What really defined it in this period?
Well, Islam itself, founded by Muhammad in the 7th century, it emphasized monotheism, good deeds, but also, crucially, trade was seen very positively. Merchants were respected. This often meant Islamic states just got wealthier than many Christian ones, where sometimes making profit was viewed a bit suspiciously. Dar al-Islam wasn't one empire, remember, but this huge cultural and economic zone, stretched from Spain to India, made trade and ideas flow pretty easily.
Right, but the Abbasid Caliphate, the one we associate with the golden age of learning, that was falling apart by 1200, wasn't it? What took its place?
That's key. By 1200, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was politically fragmented.
Yeah.
Its intellectual achievements were amazing, but politically, it was weak. It was largely replaced by various Turkic states. These groups often came in as mercenaries or nomads and ended up taking power. Like the Seljuk Empire, they took real power in the Middle East, establishing military rule. In Egypt, you had the Mamluk Sultanate. Mamluks were originally Turkic slaves, but they overthrew their rulers and set up their own powerful military state, lasted for centuries. And in India, the Delhi Sultanate was established by Muslim Turks, bringing Islamic rule to parts of South Asia. So political fragmentation, yes, but the cultural and economic zone of Dar al-Islam actually persisted, even expanded.
Okay, so different rulers, different locations, but what did these new Islamic states have in common, and how did Islam keep spreading so effectively?
They often shared traits, like military-led governance. Power rested with the military elites. And the use of Sharia law provided a common legal framework across these diverse regions, unifying them in a way. Islam kept spreading through two main ways. Military expansion, yeah, like the Delhi Sultanate pushing into India. But maybe even more importantly, through trade. Think of Mali in West Africa. They converted to Islam partly to get better access to those rich trans-Saharan trade networks. It was strategic. And Sufism played a huge role in conversion.
How so?
Sufism was this mystical, more inclusive form of Islam. It emphasized a personal, emotional connection to God that made it really appealing to ordinary people and easier to blend with existing local beliefs. Helped Islam spread widely.
And the intellectual side. Even with the political fragmentation, that Golden Age legacy seems incredibly important, especially for later developments in Europe.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The Islamic world remained this incredibly vibrant hub of intellectual innovation. In math, you had figures like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi making huge strides in trigonometry, astronomy, and crucially, preserving and translating Greek math texts. You had poets like Aisha al-Bawniya showing the depth of Sufi thought, medicine, Ibn Sina or Avicenna in the West. His Canon of Medicine was the medical textbook for centuries, in Europe too. Yeah. Philosophers like Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Sina didn't just preserve Aristotle and Plato. They commented on them, expanded on their ideas, kept classical philosophy alive. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, though declining by this point, had been this amazing center for translation, blending Greek, Persian, Indian knowledge, and the cultural transfers in Al-Andalus, that's Islamic Spain, were critical. Muslim, Jewish, Christian scholars working together translating texts, that knowledge flowed into Europe, helping fuel the Renaissance. A direct connection.
Okay, shifting over to South and Southeast Asia, a really complex mix of religions and states here. What were the main spiritual currents?
In South Asia, mainly India, Hinduism was deeply dominant. It provided this underlying cultural unity, with its polytheism, the caste system, reincarnation beliefs. But alongside it, you had the Bhakti movement gaining steam. This emphasized personal devotion, often rejecting the strict caste rules, making faith more accessible. Buddhism, which started in India, was actually declining there, mostly confined to monasteries, and Islam arrived with the Delhi Sultanate becoming the religion of the rulers, the elite in the north. What's really fascinating is the parallel between Sufism in Islam and Bhakti in Hinduism. Both emphasize personal experience, devotion, kind of bypassing the rigid orthodoxy. Shows a common trend in popular religion.
How did these different beliefs shape the political map? Who was actually ruling where?
Well, the Delhi Sultanate ruled North India, a Muslim state, over a largely Hindu population. That cultural difference was always there. In South India, the Vijayanagara Empire rose as this powerful Hindu kingdom, kind of a revival against Muslim expansion. You also had fragmented Rajput kingdoms holding out in parts of India. Then in Southeast Asia, it was even more diverse. You had Islam spreading rapidly through trade, especially in coastal areas and islands. But Buddhism remained really strong in mainland kingdoms like Thailand and Cambodia, often blending with older local beliefs.
And Southeast Asia had these powerful maritime states, right? Controlling the sea lanes seems key there?
Absolutely critical. The Srivijaya Empire earlier on had controlled the Strait of Malacca, that vital choke point for trade, and got incredibly rich taxing ships. Later, the Majapahit Empire, based in Java, was this big Hindu-Buddhist maritime power, using a tributary system. The Sukhothai Kingdom in Thailand used Theravada Buddhism to centralize power. Land-based states, like the Khmer Empire in Cambodia, built Angkor Wat, this amazing complex showing Hindu and Buddhist influences blended together. And the Sinhala dynasties in Sri Lanka kept a strong Buddhist state going for centuries. It really shows how controlling those sea routes, being plugged into the Indian Ocean trade, was crucial for wealth and power in this region.
All right, let's jump across the ocean to the Americas. Completely separate development, no contact with Afro-Eurasia yet. What's the big takeaway here for understanding these societies?
Yeah, total isolation. The key theme is just the incredible continuity, innovation, and diversity you see. They developed complex political structures, unique ways of organizing labor, sophisticated religions, all entirely on their own, often building on what came before in their own regions.
Let's start in Mesoamerica. The Maya came first, then the Aztecs built on that.
Sort of. The Maya, around 250 and 900 CE, had these decentralized city-states, linked by tribute. They were famous for their math, inventing zero independently, and their complex writing system, the glyphs. Human sacrifice was part of their religion, tied to the sun god. They definitely influenced later cultures. The Aztec Empire, or Mexica as they call themselves, they emerged later, around 1345. They expanded through military alliances, creating this tributary empire. They didn't rule directly everywhere, but demanded tribute food, goods, feathers, you name it. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was incredible. A huge city on an island in a lake, maybe 200,000 people. With floating farms called chinampas, massive pyramids, palaces, and yes, they practiced human sacrifice too, partly religious, but also used it to intimidate enemies and legitimize their rule, claiming connections to older, powerful cultures.
And then down the Andes, the Inca, they built something totally different, much more centralized, right?
Totally different approach. The Inca Empire, which really took off in the mid-1400s, was highly centralized. A massive bureaucracy controlled a huge empire stretching along the Andes. They expanded rapidly with a strong military. And their key labor system was the mita. This wasn't tribute in goods, but required labor service for mining, building roads, serving in the army. It built on older Andean traditions. So if you compare them, it's a key difference, right? Inca, centralized direct labor system. Aztecs, decentralized tributing goods. Shows different ways to run an empire.
And North America wasn't empty either. What was happening up there?
Definitely not empty. You had the Mississippian culture, around 8th, 9th CCE, based on farming, with hierarchical societies led by chiefs. They're known for building huge earthen mounds like at Cahokia near modern St. Louis, big urban center. Out in the southwest U.S., you had the Chaco and Mesa Verde cultures, incredibly innovative in managing water in dry areas. And they built those amazing cliff dwellings out of sandstone. Shows really sophisticated adaptation to tough environments, all without outside contact.
Okay, back across the Atlantic to Africa. Incredible diversity here, too, in state building. What's the main theme connecting these different African states in this period?
The key theme is really how African states develop these diverse, innovative political systems. And often, their power and expansion were directly tied to controlling major trade networks, the Indian Ocean routes on the East Coast and the Trans-Saharan routes connecting West Africa to North Africa. And many strategically adopted Islam or Christianity, adapting them to fit their own needs, often to legitimize their rule or plug into those larger global trade networks.
Tell us more about East Africa and the Indian Ocean trade. We mentioned the Swahili coast.
Right, the Swahili civilization wasn't one empire, but a string of independent city-states along the coast. Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, flourished from the 8th century on. They got rich trading gold, ivory, and enslaved people from the interior, connecting the African interior to the Indian Ocean network. Merchants became the ruling elite, and the elites often voluntarily adopted Islam. Why? It connected them to the wider Islamic world, facilitated trade, gave them prestige. The Swahili language itself reflects this, a Bantu language base, but with tons of Arabic words mixed in, a true fusion culture.
So different from, say, Song China's centralized model.
Totally different. Decentralized, trade-based, merchant elite shows there wasn't just one way to be powerful. And further inland, Great Zimbabwe, 1115 C, also got rich off this trade indirectly. They controlled resources that flowed to the coast. They built that massive stone capital, incredible structure, shows their wealth and power.
And West Africa, the big empires linked to the desert trade.
Yeah, West Africa saw these large centralized empires rise and fall over centuries. Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai. Their power came from controlling the trans-Saharan trade. Gold going north, salt coming south. Hugely profitable. We'll talk more about Mali, but it's a classic example of using Islam to boost trade connections and legitimize rule.
Were there any other unique power structures like that Christian kingdom you mentioned?
Yes, Ethiopia, a really long-lasting Christian kingdom, prominent from the 13th century on. It stood out in a mostly Muslim region. Their rulers showed their power and faith by building these incredible rock-hewn churches carved right out of mountainsides. And they got wealthy through trade links to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, also the House of Kingdoms in what's now northern Nigeria. Independent city-states, kind of like the Swahili ones, that got rich from trans-Saharan trade and adopted Islam, again, often to help with trade and legitimacy. Shows the diversity of pathways across Africa.
Okay, last stop for this period, Europe. What was the dominant force culturally, and what did the political landscape look like? Still pretty fragmented.
Yeah, the big summary point is Christianity dominated everything: culture, politics, daily life. In Western Europe, which was politically fragmented after Rome fell, the Roman Catholic Church was the main unifying institution. The Pope, bishops, they held immense power, often more than kings. The Church provided structure, education, what little there was, and inspired things like the Crusades. In the East, the Byzantine Empire had Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It was much more centralized, tied directly to the emperor's power, and they spread their influence north to Kievan Rus', early Russia, which adopted their religion and imperial style.
So what was the political system in Western Europe for most of this time? We hear about feudalism.
Right, Western Europe was mostly politically decentralized under feudalism. Kings were often quite weak. Real power was held by local nobles, the lords, who controlled land and had their own knights. It was based on loyalty oaths and land grants in exchange for military service. Tied to that was manorialism. These were self-sufficient farming estates, manors, worked by serfs who were bound to the land, couldn't leave without the lord's permission. Land was the main source of wealth, not cash. Very localized. But starting around 1200, you begin to see monarchs slowly trying to centralize power. Building bureaucracies, hiring soldiers directly, challenging the nobles. It was a long, slow process, setting the stage for future conflicts and stronger states.
It really makes you wonder, how did all these incredibly different regions, from China to the Americas to Africa to Europe, eventually get so tangled up together? Okay, here's where it gets really juicy. 1200 to 1450 wasn't just about separate places doing their own thing. It was about how they started connecting through these massive trade networks. This is super critical for the big picture, right?
Right.
This connectivity changes everything.
Absolutely. This unit, networks of exchange, it's all about the causes and effects of these growing networks. Why did they grow? What happened? Because they grew. You see cities getting incredibly wealthy, new inventions making trade easier, and crucially, culture spreading like wildfire: ideas, religions, technology, and unfortunately, disease too. Understanding these connections is vital.
Let's start with the big one, the Silk Roads. Iconic name. What was special about this overland route? What moved along it?
Yeah, the Silk Roads were this vast network of roads across Eurasia, mostly overland. Because it was tough and expensive to transport stuff, it specialized in luxury goods, things with high value, low weight. Think Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, gems, and it literally connected the empires we just talked about: China, Central Asia, the Islamic world, eventually touching Europe, a highway for high-end goods and ideas.
What made trade boom on the Silk Roads during this specific period, 1200, 1450?
Several key things came together. First, commercial innovations, especially from China. Paper money made transactions much easier and safer than lugging coins. Credit systems like flying money, basically early IOUs or bills of exchange, and the rise of banking houses made long-distance finance possible. Second, transportation innovations. Caravanserai were huge. These were like roadside inns spaced a day's journey apart, provided safe places for merchants and their animals to rest. Huge boost for trade and cultural exchange happened there. And better camel saddles meant camels could carry more weight more efficiently across deserts, made caravans more viable.
So what were the effects of all this increased trade? Who benefited? What changed?
Well, you saw the rise of these vital trading cities right on the routes. Like Kashgar in western China, a major hub where different routes met, became very Islamic. And Samarkand in Central Asia, a real crossroads, super diverse culturally and religiously. Increased demand for luxury goods meant more artisan production back in places like China and Persia. You even saw proto-industrialization in China, as we mentioned, peasants making silk instead of just farming, exporting the surplus. But the big effects were also cultural diffusion. Buddhism spread east, Islam spread west, technologies like saddles and paper making moved. And the dark side, disease diffusion. The bubonic plague, the Black Death traveled right along these routes, devastating impact.
Yeah, the Black Death. And the Mongols, they pop up again here. They conquered so much territory. How did they impact these trade networks? Seems like conquest would disrupt trade, right?
You'd think so, but it's more complicated. The Mongols, unified by Genghis Khan around 1206, created the largest land empire in history, conquered China, Central Asia, Persia, Russia. Brutal military campaigns, very effective. After Genghis died, the empire split into different parts, called khanates, like the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by his grandson Kublai Khan. And they often adapted local ways of governing, surprisingly pragmatic.
So how did this huge empire affect trade? Did it help or hurt?
Paradoxically, it helped enormously. The Mongol conquests created the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For about a century, there was unprecedented stability and safety across this vast area. This revitalized the Silk Roads, made them safer, unified under one rough political umbrella. Bandits were suppressed. The Mongols actively protected merchants, repaired roads, even built a yam system, a postal relay system with horses for rapid communication. All this promoted the movement of people, merchants, artisans, diplomats. So interregional trade actually flourished because of the Mongol conquests.
Weird, huh? And what about cultural exchange? Were they just destroying things or did knowledge move too? That's another surprising part. The Mongols often spared artisans, intellectual engineers, sometimes forcibly relocated them, but their skills were valued.
This led to significant diffusion. Medical knowledge from the Islamic world spread to Europe. Arabic numerals, which actually came from India, became widespread in Europe. The Mongols adopted the Uyghur script for their own language, so yeah, they facilitated a lot of cultural integration, often unintentionally. Conquest paving the way for connection. Fascinating.
Okay, so the Silk Roads are buzzing, partly thanks to the Mongols. But the Indian Ocean trade was also exploding, becoming this maritime superhighway. What drove its growth, and why did it become so massive?
Well, partly. As the Mongol Empire started breaking up later, the Silk Roads became less safe again. So there was a natural shift toward sea trade in the Indian Ocean, which was arguably safer and could carry bulk goods more easily. Plus, you had crucial innovations. Commercial stuff like credit, banking, similar to the Silk Roads, but also key transportation tech. The magnetic compass for direction, the astrolabe for latitude, the lantine sail letting ships sail into the wind, game changers for navigation. Bigger, better ships, too. Chinese junks were massive. Arab dhows were improved, could carry way more cargo. And really important, knowledge of the environment. Sailors mastered the predictable monsoon winds. They knew exactly when to sail east, when to sail west, made voyages reliable. Finally, the spread of Islam really helped. Islam was merchant-friendly, provided common legal ideas, built trust between traders in different ports across the ocean.
So what did this mean for the cities and states around the Indian Ocean? Who got rich?
Huge growth for port cities and states. The Swahili city-states in East Africa exporting gold, ivory, slaves from the interior. Their elites converted to Islam, built mosques plugged into that world. Malacca on the Malay Peninsula controlled the Strait of Malacca, that narrow passage. Taxed all the ships going between India and China. Became incredibly powerful and wealthy, a real bottleneck. Gujarat in India, perfectly placed, traded its cotton textiles and indigo. Became a major hub. These places became cosmopolitan centers full of merchants from everywhere.
And you mentioned diaspora communities earlier. Were they like the glue holding this network together?
That's a great way to put it. These diaspora communities, Arab, Persian, Chinese, Malay merchants settling in foreign ports were absolutely vital. They kept their own culture, but learned the local languages, understood local markets. They formed these crucial bridges, built trust, facilitated trade across huge cultural divides. They were the human network making the whole thing work smoothly.
And Zheng, his voyages, those huge Chinese fleets, where do they fit in?
Right, Zheng, his voyages in the early 1400s were incredible. Massive Ming Dynasty fleet sailing all over the Indian Ocean. They were mainly about showing off Chinese power, establishing tributary relationships, maybe projecting military might. They had gunpowder cannons on board, which definitely spread that tech. They massively increased China's presence and trade integration in the Indian Ocean for a while. Highlights how state power could directly shape these networks, though China later pulled back from these voyages.
Okay, let's not forget Africa's other major trade network, the Trans-Saharan routes, connecting North Africa with West Africa across the desert. What made that possible?
The absolute key was the Arabian camel. Introduced centuries earlier, it revolutionized desert travel. Yeah. Hardy animal. By this period, 1200 1450, they had improved camel saddles, making them better for riding and for carrying heavy loads of goods, made large caravans feasible. Caravanserai, those rest stops, helped here too. The trade linked North Africa, often Islamic, with the interior of West Africa, was traded. Mainly gold from West Africa, huge source, cola nuts, horses, slaves, and crucially, salt from the Sahara Desert, which was vital in tropical West Africa.
And this trade built empires in West Africa, right? Like
Yes.
Mali.
Absolutely. Controlling this trade was the key to power. The Mali Empire is the prime example, emerging in the 13th century. Mali's rulers converted to Islam, which helped integrate them into the wider Islamic trade networks. They grew incredibly wealthy, exporting gold and taxing the caravans passing through. It's interesting, like Malacca, Mali controlled a key trade point and taxed it to get rich. Different environment, similar strategy. And Mansa Musa, Mali's most famous ruler, his Hajj to Mecca in the 1300s was legendary. He spent so much gold in Cairo along the way, he actually caused inflation there. Shows the scale of Mali's wealth.
Okay, so we've got the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean, the Trans-Saharan routes all buzzing. What were the big picture consequences of all this connection between 1200 and 1450, culturally, environmentally?
Culturally, the diffusion of belief systems was huge. Buddhism spread east into China, Japan, Korea, blending with local ideas like Taoism to form Zen. Hinduism and Buddhism spread through Southeast Asia via the sea routes, leading to amazing architecture like Angkor Wat, often mixing with local traditions. Islam spread deep into sub-Saharan Africa and across the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia, often helping states plug into trade networks, like with the Swahili language developing. Religions were on the move.
And ideas and technologies, too.
Definitely. Remember the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the knowledge preserved there. Greek philosophy, science, math eventually flowed back into Europe, helping spark the Renaissance. Huge impact. Technologies like gunpowder from China changed warfare everywhere. Paper and printing, even if movable type didn't catch on everywhere immediately, revolutionized communication and record-keeping. These traveled along the trade routes.
What about cities? Did trade make them all boom?
Many boomed, yeah. Hangzhou in China, at the end of the Grand Canal, was massive. Kashgar, Samarkand on the Silk Roads became cosmopolitan centers, but some declined too. Baghdad itself was sacked by the Mongols in 1258, a huge blow, and Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, ending that empire. So, winners and losers.
And we heard about travelers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Their journeys became possible because of this connectivity.
Exactly. Increased safety, like under the Pax Mongolica, and better infrastructure like caravanserai made long-distance travel more feasible. So you get figures like Ibn Battuta traveling all over the Islamic world for decades, writing amazing accounts. Marjorie Kempe, a Christian woman traveling to the Holy Land. Marco Polo going to China. Their accounts gave people glimpses of this wider, interconnected world.
But it wasn't all good news, right? This connection had downsides too, especially environmentally or health-wise.
Absolutely. The spread of crops was often positive. Bananas reaching Africa from Southeast Asia helped populations grow. Champa rice exploding China's population. Citrus fruits spreading through the Islamic world. Better diets. But the flip side was disease. Connectivity meant diseases move fast. The bubonic plague, the Black Death, is the terrifying example. Started likely in Central Asia or China, spread rapidly along trade routes, killed maybe a third to a half of Europe's population. Huge death tolls elsewhere too. Shows the dark side of globalization, even back then. Connection brings risks as well as rewards.
Okay, shifting gears now. We're moving into a new period, roughly 1450 to 1750. And the big story here seems to be the rise of these massive, powerful, land-based empires. What's the main theme connecting them? What made them different?
Right, the core idea here is the emergence and massive expansion of these land-based gunpowder empires. After the Mongols faded, these new empires rose, and their power came from controlling huge land masses. And the key, their use of gunpowder weapons, cannons, muskets. This technology fundamentally changed warfare and allowed for a level of centralized control that was harder before. For your exam, understanding this gunpowder plus centralization combo is critical.
So who are the big players we absolutely need to know? The main gunpowder empires.
You got to know the big four. The Ottoman Empire, huge, controlled the Middle East, North Africa, Southeastern Europe. The Safavid Empire in Persia, modern Iran. The Mughal Empire in India. And the Qing dynasty in China, who were Manchu, not Han Chinese, but adopted Chinese systems. All of them used gunpowder aggressively to expand. Think of the Ottomans using massive cannons to finally break the walls of Constantinople in 1453. That was a gunpowder victory. They often fight each other too.
So they're huge, diverse empires. How did they actually manage them? How did they centralize power and make people, accept their rule? What were the techniques?
Great question. It took sophisticated methods. They all relied on large imperial bureaucracies to collect taxes, enforce laws, run things, and professional militaries loyal to the ruler. The Ottomans had the devshirme system. They'd conscript young Christian boys from the Balkans, convert them to Islam, train them. Some became elite administrators, others became the janissaries.
The elite soldiers.
Exactly. The Sultan's elite infantry, armed with muskets, super loyal to him, not to local lords. That's centralization. In Tokugawa, Japan, which wasn't one of the big four but shows a similar trend, the samurai were basically turned into salaried bureaucrats during peacetime, took away their independent military power, centralized control. They also used religion, art, and architecture powerfully to legitimize their rule, make people believe they should be in charge. The Aztecs used human sacrifice partly to reinforce the ruler's divine connection. European kings claimed divine right. God put them there. The Songhai emperors in Africa promoted Islam to unify their diverse subjects. The king emperors had imperial portraits made, showing them as wise Confucian rulers to legitimize their foreign rule over China. The Inca built the Sun Temple, covered in gold, to show the ruler's descent from the sun god. The Mongols built stunning things like the Taj Mahal, showcasing wealth, power, piety, and Louis XIV built the incredible Palace of Versailles, forced his nobles to live there with him.
Keeping them close and under control.
Exactly. Weakened their independent power bases back home, all about demonstrating absolute power. And finally, you got to pay for all this. Tax collection was key. The Mongols used zamindars, local elites who collected taxes for the empire. The Ottomans used tax farming, auctioned off the right to collect taxes. The Aztecs had detailed tribute lists demanding goods from conquered people. And the Ming dynasty in China started collecting taxes mainly in silver. Big deal. Created huge demand for silver globally.
How did religion fit into all this? These empires often ruled over people with different faiths. Did it cause problems, unite people?
Both. In Europe, Christianity was still dominant, but the Protestant Reformation absolutely shattered its unity. Started by Martin Luther in 1517, his 95 Theses challenging church corruption, especially indulgences, led to a permanent split, Catholics versus Protestants, and centuries of brutal religious wars followed, tearing Europe apart until 1648. Fundamentally changed the map.
And in the Islamic world, there was that existing split between Sunni and Shia. Did that get worse during this time?
Oh yeah, it intensified massively, mainly because it got tangled up with political rivalry. The Ottoman Empire was strongly Sunni. The Safavid Empire was officially Shia. They were major rivals, fought wars constantly. This political conflict deepened the religious divide, made the Sunni-Shia split much more militarized and hostile across the Islamic world.
Did any new faiths emerge from this period of mixing cultures and empires?
Yes, particularly in India under the Mongols, who were Muslim rulers over a mostly Hindu population. The Bhakti movement in Hinduism continued, focusing on personal devotion, sharing some mystical vibes with Sufism. But the big new one was Sikhism, emerged in the Punjab region, blended ideas from Islam, like monotheism, and Hinduism, like reincarnation. Crucially, Sikhism rejected the caste system and stressed gender equality. A really powerful new syncretic faith born out of this complex religious environment shows how empires had to navigate, or sometimes created, religious diversity.
Okay, now for a really huge shift. 1450 to 1750. This is where the world really gets connected across the oceans, mainly driven by European maritime expansion. What allowed this incredible leap? How did it totally change the global game?
This is absolutely pivotal. The main idea is that sea-based empires became dominant. Power shifted away from the land-based empires we just talked about. And it was enabled by this amazing story of technology diffusion and innovation. Europeans borrowed knowledge, then built on it.
Yeah.
For your exam, this shift to sea power and the resulting global connections, that's the core development leading to our modern world.
So when Europeans started sailing across oceans, they weren't inventing all the tech from scratch, were they? They borrowed a lot.
Exactly. This is super important. They benefited hugely from cross-cultural interactions. They adopted technologies developed elsewhere in the classical world, the Islamic world, Asia. Things like the magnetic compass came from China. The astrolabe for finding latitude, perfected by Arab scholars, based on Greek ideas, the lateen sail, that triangular one, used by Arab merchants in the Indian Ocean to let ships sail against the wind. Critical. Astronomical charts, based on centuries of work by Muslim astronomers. It raises that key question again. How does adapting existing knowledge lead to transformation? They put these pieces together in new ways.
So they borrowed this knowledge. What did they add? How did they innovate to make these long, dangerous ocean voyages possible?
They made huge leaps in shipbuilding. The Portuguese developed the caravel, small, fast, maneuverable, could sail in shallow water, carry cannons, perfect for exploring coastlines and fighting. Then the bigger carrack, more cargo space, more guns, better for long-haul voyages and dominating trade routes. Later, the Dutch came up with the fluid. This was brilliant. Designed purely for cargo, big belly, small crew needed, super efficient, cut costs massively. By the 1600s, flutes were carrying maybe half of Europe's sea trade. These ship designs gave them a real edge.
Why were European states suddenly so obsessed with sea exploration? What was the main driving force behind sponsoring these risky, expensive voyages?
It was definitely state-sponsored. These newly centralizing monarchies were funding it. The huge motivation, spices from Asia, Southeast Asia. Spices were incredibly valuable for preserving food, medicine, just making bland food taste better. But getting them overland was super expensive, controlled by Italian merchants and Muslim empires like the Ottomans. Europeans desperately wanted a cheaper direct sea route to bypass the middlemen and get those spices themselves. Portugal led the charge. They were kind of stuck geographically facing the Atlantic. Prince Henry the Navigator was a key patron. Their motivations were that classic mix. Technology, using the new tools and ships. Economics, first gold from Africa, then spices, spices, spices. And religion, spreading Christianity, fighting Muslims. Their strategy. A trading post empire. Not big colonies, but fortified ports along coast to control trade routes. Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498, showed the wealth was real, and their cannon-armed ships could dominate local traders. Spain jumped in right after. Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh off unifying Spain, funded Christopher Columbus. He sailed west in 1492, hit the Caribbean, thought it was Asia.
Oops.
Huge, but it opened up the Americas. Later, Magellan's cruise circled the globe, proved it was a new world. Spain then shifted focus to colonizing the Americas, started the whole transatlantic trade, which eventually became even bigger than the Indian Ocean trade. Soon, France, England, the Dutch all joined the scramble, setting up their own colonies, trading posts, intense rivalry for wealth and global power. It was a full-on race.
Okay, here it is. The moment the two halves of the world, isolated for thousands of years, finally collided. The Columbian Exchange. What was it, and what were its absolutely massive effects?
Yeah, the Columbian Exchange is the term for this enormous transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, ideas, and people between the Eastern Hemisphere, Eurasia, and the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, after 1492. It totally reshaped everything. Diets, populations, economies, environments on both sides of the Atlantic. One of the most significant turning points in world history.
Let's start with the dark side, the diseases. This was catastrophic for the Americans, right?
Catastrophic is an understatement. It was the Great Dying. People in Afro-Eurasia had built up immunity over centuries to diseases like smallpox, measles, malaria, flu. Native Americans had zero immunity. These diseases swept through, causing massive population declines. We're talking maybe up to 90% dead in some areas. Unimaginable loss of life. And tragically, this devastation made European conquest much easier. Fewer people left to resist.
But things went the other way too, right? New plants and animals that changed Afro-Eurasia.
Absolutely. Europeans brought old world crops to the Americas: wheat, grapes, olives, bananas, sugar cane. Sugar became huge, driving the demand for slave labor. But crops from the Americas revolutionized diets elsewhere. Maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peanuts, manioc, cassava. These spread to Europe, Africa, Asia. They were often high-calorie, easy to grow. Result? Better nutrition, longer lifespans, huge population growth outside the Americas after 1700. Potatoes in Ireland, corn and cassava in Africa, sweet potatoes in China, massive impact. We also saw cash cropping take off, like sugar, tobacco, but usually tied to forced labor.
And animals.
Europeans brought over domesticated animals the Americas didn't have. Pigs, sheep, cattle, goats, horses. They thrived, often with no natural predators. Supported ranching economies, though sometimes they caused environmental damage, like overgrazing. But horses. Horses were revolutionary for many Native American groups, especially in the Great Plains. Totally changed hunting, warfare, mobility, a huge transformation from just one animal.
So Europe sets up these maritime empires. How did they keep control? And what kind of labor systems did they use to make these colonies profitable, especially in the Americas?
Well, the motives were still that gold, God, and glory mix. Portugal stuck mostly to trading posts. Spain built huge colonies, even across the Pacific and the Philippines. The Dutch kicked out the Portuguese in many places. France and Britain carved out their own territories. But it's important to remember, Asian and African merchants didn't just disappear. They kept trading, sometimes even benefiting from more traffic. And big Asian states like Ming China and Tokugawa Japan mostly managed to keep Europeans at arm's length through isolationist policies, resisted being colonized. In the Americas, colonial economies were all about agriculture for export, cash crops. To get the labor, they used various systems, often brutal. They'd added the Inca Midas system for silver mining in places like Potosi. Horrific conditions, but they also created new systems. Chattel slavery became dominant, especially for sugar plantations. Africans treated as property, hereditary slavery based on race. Indentured servitude brought over Europeans who worked for a set time. The Spanish used the encomienda system, granting landowners rights to indigenous labor, basically feudalism. And the hacienda system, large estates using native labor for farming or ranching. Mostly coerced labor, fueling the whole thing.
And slavery itself changed dramatically, becoming this massive, brutal, racialized system.
Yes. While slavery existed elsewhere, the transatlantic slave trade was unprecedented in scale, over 12 million Africans forcibly shipped over centuries. It caused huge demographic shifts in Africa, especially gender imbalance because plantation owners often preferred male slaves. And crucially, in the Americas, slavery became intensely racialized, explicitly linked to being black. This justified the dehumanization and brutality of the plantation system, creating these deep-seated racial hierarchies that lasted long after slavery ended. It really makes you ask, how did these global connections forge new, brutal forms of identity and inequality?
How did these empires keep the money flowing? What economic theories guided them, and what were the wider social and cultural results of all this mixing?
The main economic theory was mercantilism. The idea was that national wealth was fixed, measured in gold and silver, so states needed to export more than they imported, hoard precious metals, and use colonies as sources of raw materials and captive markets for their manufactured goods. It was all about state control for national advantage. A key development was the joint stock company, like the Dutch East India Company, VOC, or the British East India Company. These were amazing innovations, funded by private investors who bought shares, had limited liability so investors only risked their investment, not everything. This allowed massive private funding for colonization and trade, reducing the risk for the state, led to intense competition, even wars between these companies and nations.
And the trade networks themselves, did the Atlantic trade replace the older ones?
Not entirely replaced, but a new dominant system emerged. Afro-Eurasian trade continued, sure, but the Atlantic trading system, the triangular trade, became huge, linking Europe, manufactured goods, Africa, enslaved people, and the Americas, sugar, tobacco, cotton, a cycle driven by profit and coerced labor. And Spanish silver from the Americas, especially Potosi, was the lubricant for this whole global economy. It flowed to Europe, but also massively to Asia, especially China, which needed silver for its taxes. This silver really connected the Atlantic and Asian markets into one global system for the first time.
What about the social side? All these people moving, interacting, what kind of cultures emerged?
Well, the slave trade caused that gender imbalance in Africa, changing family structures. In the Americas, enslaved Africans, coming from diverse backgrounds, created new Creole languages, mixing African languages with European ones, a form of resistance and adaptation. You saw this broader cultural synthesis, mixtures of African, European, and indigenous traditions in music, religion, food. Catholic missionaries tried to convert indigenous people, often forcefully imposing European culture, but this also led to syncretic religions blending Christian saints with native gods, like Vodou in Haiti or Santeria in Cuba. Enslaved Africans also brought their own religions, Islam and traditional beliefs, which also sometimes blended, creating incredibly rich, complex new cultures.
All right, buckle up. We're hitting 1750 to 1900, the age of revolutions. This is where things get really shaken up. Two massive transformations happening simultaneously that basically create the modern world as we know it.
Exactly. This unit is all about two huge things. Political revolutions, sparked by radical new ideas about rights and government, and the Industrial Revolution, which completely changed how we make things, where people lived, and who held power. Understanding how these two revolutions, one of ideas, one of machines interacted, is absolutely key for the big picture. They fueled each other, clashed. It's a dynamic period.
Let's start with the ideas, the Enlightenment. What was this movement, and how did it lay the intellectual groundwork for tearing down old systems?
The Enlightenment was this intellectual explosion, mostly in Europe, where thinkers applied reason and empiricism observation, evidence to understand human society, not just nature, but politics, religion, economics. It grew out of the scientific revolution. If the universe follows rational laws, they argued, shouldn't society too? It directly challenged tradition, monarchy, religious authority.
What were the core concepts, the really big ideas that got people thinking differently?
Key ideas: rationalism, reason over faith or tradition; empiricism, knowledge comes from experience; new views on religion like deism, God as a clockmaker who doesn't interfere; or even atheism. But politically, the game changers were individualism, the individual matters; natural rights, life, liberty, property, thanks John Locke; and the social contract.
The idea that government exists because people agree to it.
Exactly. Government by consent of the governed. And if the government breaks the contract, fails to protect rights, the people have the right to overthrow it. revolutionary stuff. It basically said power comes from the people, not from God or birthright.
How did these ideas translate into actual change on the ground? Revolutions, reforms?
They directly inspired the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions. All of them challenged monarchy, aristocracy, demanded popular sovereignty, created concepts of citizenship. They also fueled the push for expanded suffrage, voting rights, the abolition of slavery, arguing slavery violated natural rights, the end of serfdom, and laid the groundwork for feminism and women's suffrage. Thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft used Enlightenment logic to argue for women's rights, led to things like the Seneca Falls Conference later on. Massive long-term impact.
Nationalism also exploded during this time. How did that idea drive these revolutions and redraw the map?
Nationalism was this powerful new force, the idea that people are bound together by shared language, culture, history, territory, and that this shared identity, this nation should have its own independent state. It could unify people to overthrow foreign rulers or create new nations, but it could also be used to justify conflict between nations, a really potent double-edged sword.
So the big Atlantic revolutions, America, France, Haiti, Latin America, how did nationalism and Enlightenment ideas mix in those?
They were all deeply intertwined. The American Revolution, 1776. Colonists developed a separate American identity, resented British rule, no taxation without representation, used Enlightenment ideas of natural rights in the Declaration of Independence, created the USA. The French Revolution, 1789, fueled by Enlightenment ideas and French nationalism against an incompetent monarchy, led to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The Haitian Revolution, 1791. Absolutely groundbreaking. Enslaved people took French revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality literally, rose up under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, creating the first Black Republic. Intense nationalism against French rule. Latin American revolutions, led by Creoles like Simon Bolivar, fueled by Enlightenment ideas and a growing sense of separate identity from Spain-Portugal, created many new independent nations.
And outside the Atlantic world, did nationalism spark movements elsewhere?
Oh, yes. You had the propaganda movement in the Philippines against Spain, more intellectual, pushing for reforms. Fierce Maori nationalism in the New Zealand wars against British settlers. Figures like Lola Rodriguez de Tio promoting Puerto Rican identity. Plus, the unification of Germany and Italy. These weren't unified countries before. Nationalism brought fragmented states together into single nations. Balkan nationalisms chipping away at the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. Even within the Ottoman Empire, you had Ottomanism, an attempt to create a unified identity to counter ethnic nationalism, but it mostly failed. Nationalism was reshaping everything.
Okay, the other huge revolution, the Industrial Revolution. What exactly was it, fundamentally? And why Britain? Why did it start there? Seems like a lot had to line up just right.
It really did.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution was this fundamental shift from farming economies where things were made by hand to machine-based industrial economies centered in factories. Changed everything. Why Britain? A confluence of factors. Waterways, lots of navigable rivers, canals for transport, plus water power for early mills. Resources, huge, easily accessible deposits of coal, the fuel, and iron, the building material. Absolutely critical. Foreign resources. Its empire gave access to raw materials like cotton from India and timber from North America. Agricultural revolution. More food meant a bigger population, and fewer people needed on farms, freeing up labor for factories. Urbanization. People moved to cities looking for work. Created a concentrated labor force. Property rights. Strong legal protection for private property encouraged investment. Capital, wealth from trade, including the slave trade, provided money to invest in factories and machines. A unique combination.
So what was this new factory system actually like? How did it change how things were made?
Factories brought workers and machines together under one roof. Centralized production. Initially water-powered, then steam-powered took over. New machines like the spinning jenny or the power loom totally sped up textile production, massively increased output. And crucially, the machines often required less skill than traditional crafts, led to mass production with easily replaceable low-wage workers. Very different from the old artisan system.
So Britain starts it, but it spreads. How did industrialization move across the world? And what did it mean for places that used to be manufacturing centers?
Steam power was key to the spread. Factories didn't need to be by rivers anymore. Steamships, railroads, they moved goods and resources faster and farther, connecting markets globally. But it spread unevenly, depended on things like having coal and iron, political stability, money to invest. France was a bit slower. The U.S. boomed after its Civil War. Russia industrialized late, driven by the state, like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but very harsh conditions. Japan is the fascinating outlier, faced Western threats, so deliberately industrialized super fast during the Meiji Restoration, became a major power quickly, unlike many neighbors.
Right. What happened to places like India or Egypt that used to make world-class textiles?
That's the really tough part of the story. Regions that were once dominant manufacturing centers saw their industries decline, often deliberately dismantled by colonial powers like Britain. India and Egypt's textile production couldn't compete with cheap, mass-produced British goods flooding their markets, often protected by colonial tariffs. Indian shipbuilding also declined. It created this global division. Industrial nations made manufactured goods, colonies supplied raw materials and bought the finished products, led to economic dependency, a huge power shift.
Beyond steam, what other new technologies emerged during this industrial age? We hear about a second industrial revolution.
Yeah, the first was mostly coal, steam, iron, textiles. The second industrial revolution, late 19th century, brought new stuff, new fuels. Oil became crucial, led to the internal combustion engine, smaller, more portable power source, hello, automobiles, massively increased energy, but also pollution.
What else came out of that second wave? Steel, chemicals, electricity.
All of the above. Big advances in steel production. The Bessemer process made it cheap and strong. Allowed skyscrapers, better bridges, railroads. Chemical engineering took off synthetic dyes, fertilizers, and electricity. Thomas Edison, light bulbs. Changed everything from factory work hours to city life with electric trolleys. Plus, communication was revolutionized by the telegraph. Samuel Morse, first transatlantic cable in the 1870s. Suddenly, messages crossed oceans in minutes, not weeks, shrinking the world dramatically.
So what were the effects of faster transport, instant communication?
Yeah, huge effects. Railroads opened up interior regions like the American West, Siberia. Global trade exploded. And transportation advances fueled mass migration. People could move farther, faster, cheaper than ever before, both within countries, rural to urban, and overseas. Huge demographic shifts.
Did governments just sit back and watch this happen? Or did they actively try to shape industrialization?
Well, they were definitely involved. Some governments pushed state-sponsored industrialization, often defensively, like Muhammad Ali in Egypt. Tried to build factories, modernize, resist European influence, but Britain basically shut him down to protect their own trade interests. Shows how power dynamics worked. Japan, again, the Meiji Restoration was totally state-driven industrialization, specifically to avoid being dominated by the West.
Well,
Hugely successful, relatively speaking.
and economically, the philosophy changed, right? Away from mercantilism.
Big time. Western Europe shifted from mercantilism, state control, hoarding gold, towards free market capitalism. Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations were incredibly influential, argued for laissez-faire. Let it be. Let the market, the invisible hand, regulate itself with minimal government interference, believed it would lead to more wealth overall.
Was everyone on board with pure laissez-faire?
Not entirely. Some thinkers, like Jeremy Bentham, argue the government did need to step in to protect workers. Others, like Friedrich List in Germany, advocated for protective tariffs to help new industries grow before facing British competition. Nationalism versus pure free trade.
And how did the structure of business change to handle this global scale?
You saw the rise of massive transnational corporations operating across borders like HSBC Bank or Unilever Consumer Goods. New financial tools like stock markets became essential for raising capital, and limited liability corporations made investing less risky, encouraging more people to put money into industrial ventures. Fueled growth.
So overall effects of industrial capitalism: more wealth, better living standards.
For many, yes. Industrial nations got much richer. A rising standard of living for the growing middle class especially. Mass-produced goods became cheaper, more available. Mechanized farming meant more food, better diets for many, improved public health overall. But, and it's a big but, the wealth wasn't evenly distributed, and it came with huge social and environmental costs.
Right, those costs. The harsh conditions led to pushback, right? Calls for reform, new ideas.
Absolutely. Industrial capitalism created terrible conditions for the working class, dangerous factories, long hours, low pay, awful slums. This sparked calls for political, social, educational, urban reforms. Workers formed labor unions to fight for better wages and conditions, often facing violent suppression. New political parties emerged representing workers.
And radical critiques like Marxism emerged too.
Yes. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, critiqued capitalism as inherently exploitative, dividing society into the bourgeoisie owners and proletariat workers. They predicted workers would eventually revolt, overthrow capitalism, and create a classless communist society. Hugely influential ideology for the next century.
Did other states outside the West try their own reforms to catch up or resist, like China or the Ottomans?
They did try. Both King China and the Ottoman Empire attempted defensive modernization. China's self-strengthening movement, 1860s-70s, tried to adopt Western technology, especially military tech, while keeping Confucian culture. But it was half-hearted, faced resistance, and failed, shown by their defeat by Japan. The Ottoman Tanzimat reforms introduced Western-style factories, laws, schools, sparked movements like the Young Ottomans. But ultimately, it wasn't enough to stop the empire's decline.
And what about the new social structure, the classes, the problems in the cities?
Industrialization created new classes. A huge industrial working class, often living in poverty, a prosperous middle class of professionals and managers, and a small group of super wealthy industrialists. Gender roles shifted too. Working class women often worked in factories for lower pay than men. Middle class women were increasingly confined to the home, the separate sphere. And the cities faced massive problems. Terrible pollution from coal, lack of sanitation, overcrowded tenements, disease, rising crime. Huge challenges came with industrial progress.
Okay, so industrialization happened. Now let's look at the consequences, especially this massive second wave of imperialism in the late 19th century. What drove this new scramble for colonies? How was it different?
Yeah, this is a direct consequence. Earlier imperialism was different trade posts, the Americas. This new wave was driven by new ideologies, justifying domination, and the insatiable hunger of industrial economies for raw materials and new markets. Industrial power allowed European nations and the US and Japan to conquer vast territories incredibly quickly. It redrew the map of Africa and Asia.
So it wasn't just God, gold, glory anymore. What were these new justifications they came up with?
They added new layers. 4 key ones. Nationalism. Intense competition between nations. Having a big empire became a status symbol, proof of national greatness. Scientific racism. Awful pseudoscience like measuring skulls, phrenology, claiming Europeans were biologically superior, fitter to rule over lesser races, gave it a supposedly scientific basis. Social Darwinism. Twisted Darwin's ideas. Applied survival of the fittest to nations and races. Argued it was natural, even good, for strong industrial nations to dominate weaker ones. Civilizing mission. The idea that Europeans had a moral duty to civilize the backward peoples of the world, bringing them Christianity, Western education, government, framing conquest as a noble, benevolent act, masked the exploitation.
How did they actually do? How did they take control of so much territory so fast? And who were the main players this time?
The focus shifted to Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. Spain and Portugal were less powerful now. The big players were Britain, France, the Dutch, plus newcomers like Germany, Italy, Belgium, and non-European powers like the United States, expanding west and overseas, and Japan, expanding in Asia.
How? Several ways. There was a shift from private company rule to direct state control.
Like the East India companies. That's exactly. The Belgian Congo started as King Leopold's horrific private property, then the state took over. The Dutch government took over from the VOC in Indonesia. The British government took over India from the East India Company after the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion. More direct control, they used diplomacy and warfare. The Berlin Conference, 1884-85, is infamous. European powers just sat down and carved up Africa with rulers and pencils, ignoring ethnic boundaries. No Africans invited. Led to chaos later and constant warfare. Britain fought the Ashanti in West Africa, Belgium's brutal regime in the Congo, France and Algeria. They established settler colonies, sending their own people to live there, displacing locals. Think Britain and Australia and New Zealand. Devastating impact on indigenous people. And some powers just conquered neighbors. The U.S. with manifest destiny across North America, Russia expanding east and south, Japan moving into Korea and Manchuria after industrializing.
How did people react to being taken over? Did they just accept it? There must have been resistance.
Oh, absolutely. Resistance was constant, though often tragically unsuccessful against industrial firepower. It took many forms. Direct resistance, armed rebellion. You had the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in Peru earlier. Later, Samori Touré fighting the French in West Africa. Asantewa leading the Ashanti against the British. The big Sepoy Rebellion in India. All fierce armed struggles. Creating new states. Sometimes resistance led to new states forming, at least temporarily. The independent Balkan states breaking from the Ottomans, the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, the Cherokee Nation trying to establish sovereignty in the U.S., the powerful Zulu Kingdom fighting the British in South Africa. Religious resistance. Often, resistance movements had a strong religious element. The ghost dance among Native Americans in the U.S., the Xhosa cattle killing in South Africa. a tragic response to a prophecy. The Mahdist Wars in Sudan against the British, using faith to inspire resistance against overwhelming odds.
Okay, so imperialism reshaped the political map. How did it reshape the global economy? What did industrial powers want from these colonies?
Primarily, raw materials for their factories and food for their urban workers. This led to the creation of export economies in the colonies. They stopped growing diverse crops for themselves and started specializing in one or two things. The imperial power wanted cotton, rubber, palm oil, diamonds, whatever, grown for export, not for local needs.
Can you give some examples?
Sure, cotton from Egypt and India for British mills, rubber from the Amazon and the Congo under horrific forced labor for tires, palm oil from West Africa for soap and industrial lubricants, guano, bird poop from Peru as fertilizer for European farms, meat from Argentina shipped to Europe using new refrigerated ships, diamonds from South Africa controlled by companies like De Beers.
So what was the long-term effect on the colonies, focusing on just exporting raw materials?
It made them incredibly dependent on the imperial power.
Yeah.
They earned money from exports, yes, but then they had to buy expensive manufactured goods back from the colonizer. Often, land used for food was converted to cash crops, making them vulnerable to famine. It destroyed local industries and locked them into this subordinate economic role, created lasting global inequality.
Was it always direct conquest? Or could imperial powers control places economically without planting a flag? What's economic imperialism?
Yeah, sometimes control was more indirect, but just as powerful. Economic imperialism is when one country dominates another country's economy through trade, investment, and loans, creating dependency without formal political rule.
The Opium Wars in China seem like a prime example of this, right? Using economics then force.
Textbook example. Britain won in Chinese tea, but China didn't want British goods. Trade imbalance. So Britain starts illegally smuggling opium from India into China. Gets millions addicted, reverses the silver flow. China tries to stop it. Britain declares war. First Opium War. Britain's industrial military easily wins. Forces China to open ports, pay damages, grant Britain special privileges. This leads to more unequal treaties, carving China into spheres of influence. Foreign powers controlled trade and investment in different regions, even though China remained technically independent. Economic control backed by military threat. You also saw it in Latin America, like British banks investing heavily in Argentina's railroads and ports, effectively tying Argentina's economy to British demand for its beef and wheat. Control through finance.
All this change, industrialization, imperialism, new transport led to huge numbers of people moving around the globe, right? What caused this mass migration?
Several big factors. Demographic changes. World population was growing fast. Farms needed fewer workers due to machines. Cities were booming. People needed somewhere to go. Environmental factors. Famines pushed people out, like the massive Irish potato famine sent millions to the U.S. Economic opportunities. Industrial jobs in some places. Plantation labor, often forced in others. Gold rushes. Pulled people across oceans. And crucially, new transportation. Railroads and steamships made long-distance travel much faster and cheaper, made mass migration feasible.
What kinds of migration were there? Was it all voluntary?
Definitely not all voluntary. You had voluntary workers, sure, millions of Europeans moving to the Americas, Chinese laborers building railroads in the U.S., British engineers going to India or Africa, but also coerced labor. Convicts sent to penal colonies like Australia, and semi-coerced indentured servitude. People signing contracts, often misleading, to work for years in exchange for passage. Huge numbers of Indians went to the Caribbean, Fiji, Africa. Chinese went to Southeast Asia, the Americas. Filled labor shortages after slavery was abolished, often under terrible conditions.
What were the social effects? People from all over the world mixing in new places.
Huge effects. Often gender imbalance back home, as mostly men migrated, leaving women to take on new roles. Migrants formed ethnic enclaves in new countries. Chinatowns, Little Italys, Irish neighborhoods. Preserved culture, provided support networks, led to cultural diffusion, food, music, religion spreading. But it also caused backlash. Nativism hostility towards immigrants led to discrimination, prejudice, and restrictive laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the U.S. or the White Australia policy, a real mix of cultural enrichment and social tension.
Okay, entering the 20th century now, 1900 to the present. And this era is just dominated by conflict on a scale never seen before. Starts with old empires crumbling, leads into two absolutely devastating world wars.
Yeah, this unit is heavy. It's about huge shifts in global power, the causes and the horrifying conduct of the world wars, and the mass atrocities that accompanied them. Understanding how these conflicts reshaped the entire planet is crucial for grasping the world today.
So the 20th century kicks off with some really old empires finally collapsing. Which ones were they, and why couldn't they hold on?
Right. Several major land-based empires that had lasted centuries couldn't adapt to the modern industrial world and collapsed. The Ottoman Empire. Reform movements like the Young Turks tried to modernize, but pushing Turkish nationalism alienated minorities. It finally collapsed after being on the losing side of WWI. The Russian Empire. The Russian Revolution in 1917 overthrew the Tsar. Years of unrest from slow industrialization, autocratic rule, and disastrous losses in WWI led to the Bolsheviks under Lenin taking power, creating the communist USSR King China. Collapsed after decades of internal rebellion, like the Taiping, and external defeats. Opium Wars lost to Japan. Sun Yat-sen finally ended imperial rule, but it led to instability and eventually civil war. And the Mexican Revolution started in 1910. Not an old empire, but a major revolution against authoritarian rule, Porfirio Diaz, involving peasant armies like Zapata's, leading to a new constitution and significant social change. An era of empires ending.
All that instability, plus the imperial rivalries we talked about, sets the stage perfectly for World War I. What were the main long-term causes? We can use that acronym, MAIN.
Exactly. MAIN is the key. Militarism and arms race. Nations building huge armies and navies fueled by industry. Belief that military power was key to national greatness. Germany's buildup was especially worrying to others. Alliances. Complex web of secret and public alliances. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy initially, versus the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia, meant a small conflict could drag everyone in, like dominoes. Imperialism. The scramble for colonies was mostly over, but competition for resources and influence remained intense, caused friction. Nationalism. Intense pride, rivalry, suspicion between nations, people willing to fight and die for their country's honor or interests, made diplomacy difficult.
And the spark that lit the fuse.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo in June 1914. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia, makes demands. Russia backs Serbia. Germany backs Austria-Hungary. The alliance system kicks in, and boom, World War I begins.
WWI was called a total war. What did that mean in practice, and how did new technology make it so uniquely horrific?
Total war meant the whole nation was mobilized. Not just soldiers, but civilians, industry, the economy. Everyone was involved. Everyone was a potential target. Governments used massive propaganda campaigns to demonize the enemy, keep morale up, encourage sacrifice. Nationalism fueled it.
And the tech. Machine guns, gas.
This technology was devastating. Machine guns made defense incredibly strong. Poison gas was terrifying. Tanks were introduced but weren't decisive yet. Submarines, U-boats, choked supply lines. Airplanes were used for scouting, then bombing. All this led to trench warfare on the Western Front. Miles of muddy, rat-infested trenches. Huge battles with hundreds of thousands of casualties for tiny gains of land. Static, brutal, industrialized slaughter made the war drag on for years.
And it was truly global, involving colonies.
Yes, millions of colonial troops from Africa, India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand fought for their imperial powers, often with the hope of gaining more rights or independence after the war. A hope that was largely betrayed, leading to more nationalism later.
What finally broke the stalemate and ended the war?
The U.S. entering the war in 1917 was a major factor. Fresh troops, resources, tipped the balance. Germany launched a final offensive in 1918. It failed, and their allies started collapsing. The war ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. But the treaty was incredibly harsh on Germany. Huge reparations, lost territory, demilitarization, the infamous war guilt clause created deep resentment in Germany, directly setting the stage for WWII.
The years between the wars, the 20s and 30s, were rough economically, weren't they?
Very unstable. The Treaty of Versailles reparations crippled Germany. They printed money to pay, leading to insane hyperinflation in the early 20s. Money became worthless overnight. This strained everyone, as Britain and France needed German payments to repay their own war debts to the U.S. The global financial system was shaky. Plus, the new Soviet Union refused to pay the old Tsarist debts.
And then the Great Depression hit. Started in the U.S.
Yeah, the U.S. stock market crashed in 1929, led to bank failures, mass unemployment, global trade collapsing. Protectionist measures like the U.S. Smoot-Hawley tariff just made things worse, sparking trade wars. It became a worldwide depression, hitting industrialized nations and colonies alike. Devastating.
How did governments try to cope? Did laissez-faire work?
Laissez-faire totally failed. Governments had to intervene. Different approaches. In the U.S., FDR's New Deal used government spending to create jobs, provide social safety nets, social security, Keynesian economics. In Italy and Germany, fascist corporatist economies emerged. The state took tight control of industry, directing it for national goals, especially rearmament, eliminated independent unions. In Latin America, you saw state-led development, Leaders like Vargas in Brazil tried to reduce foreign dependency, nationalize industries, promote local production, more state intervention everywhere.
So WWI ends, but the peace feels shaky. What tensions were left simmering that pointed towards another war?
Lots. The mandate system was one. The Allies took over German and Ottoman colonies, supposedly to guide them to independence,
Mhm.
but they basically ran them like colonies, fueled anti-colonial anger.
And Japan was on the move.
Yeah, Japan felt snubbed by the West after WWI became more militaristic and expansionist. Invaded Manchuria in 1931, defying the League of Nations, started building its empire, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, nice name, brutal reality. Clear challenge to the existing order.
Anti-imperialism was still growing too.
Definitely. Movements like the Indian National Congress under Gandhi were gaining strength, using nonviolent protest. The African National Congress, ANC, fighting for rights in South Africa. The desire for self-determination wasn't going away.
Okay, so all this unresolved stuff, plus the Depression, leads us right into World War II. What were the main causes this time?
Several interconnected causes. Unsustainable peace. The Treaty of Versailles was seen as deeply unfair in Germany, fueling Hitler's rise. Continued imperialism aggression, Japan's invasion of China, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, Germany rearming and taking back territory, Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement by Britain and France, hoping to avoid war, just emboldened Hitler. Global economic crisis. The Depression created desperation, making people susceptible to extremist leaders promising solutions. Rise of fascism and totalitarianism. This was crucial. Stalin's Soviet Union was totalitarian, but fascism in Italy, Mussolini, and Nazism in Germany, Hitler, were aggressively expansionist, extreme nationalism, militarism, anti-democratic, racist, especially Nazism, blaming Jews for everything. These ideologies made war almost inevitable.
WWII was total war again, but even worse. How was it fought? How were the ideologies reflected on the battlefield?
Even more total. Governments used intense propaganda, rationing, mobilized entire populations. Civilians were bombed relentlessly. Ideologies clashed brutally. Fascism, Axis, Germany, Italy, Japan, glorified war, used forced labor, committed atrocities. Communism, Soviet Union, mobilized through state control, immense sacrifice. Democracy, allies, Britain, US, etc. Rallied populations through appeals to freedom, but also restricted rights sometimes, like Japanese-American internment in the US.
And the military tactics and tech, even more destructive.
Way more destructive. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, used tanks and planes for fast, overwhelming attacks, made trench warfare obsolete, strategic bombing flattened cities, firebombing Dresden, Tokyo, naval warfare with aircraft carriers, and the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb, developed by the U.S., used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, instantly destroyed cities, killed hundreds of thousands, forced Japan's surrender, and ushered in the nuclear age.
And the outcome?
The Allies won, defeat in fascism, but the cost was astronomical. WWII was the deadliest conflict in human history. Estimates range from 50 to 80 million dead, mostly civilians. Unfathomable destruction.
This era also saw state-sponsored mass murder on an industrial scale. Mass atrocities. What drove this, and what were the horrifying examples?
It was a terrifying convergence of extremist ideologies, especially racist ones like Nazism, the brutality of total war, and new technologies for control and killing. Civilians became targets on an unprecedented scale.
The Holocaust is the most infamous.
Yes, the Holocaust. Nazi Germany's systematic state-sponsored genocide of 6 million Jews, plus millions of others. Roma, disabled people, political opponents. Driven by racist ideology, carried out with chilling efficiency in concentration and extermination camps. But there were others. The Armenian genocide during WWI by the Ottoman Empire, the Cambodian genocide in the 1970s under the Khmer Rouge, killing millions in their own country, the Rwandan genocide in 1994, horrific ethnic violence, Stalin's forced famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor killing millions. A century marked by state-sponsored mass murder.
Okay, emerging from the ashes of World War II, the world looks totally different again. We entered this long period defined by two huge intertwined forces, the Cold War and decolonization.
Exactly. Post-WWII is all about the rise of two new superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, and the simultaneous collapse of the old European empires, leading to dozens of new nations. These two trends constantly shaped each other.
How did the US and USSR end up as the two dominant powers after WWII? What gave them the edge?
Both came out of the war relatively stronger than anyone else, though in different ways. The U.S. economy boomed during the war. Its homeland was untouched by major fighting. It used its wealth to rebuild Western Europe with the Marshall Plan gaining influence. The Soviet Union suffered terribly, but its state-controlled economy focused on heavy industry allowed it to rebuild its military quickly. It controlled vast territory in Eastern Europe.
And the atomic bomb changed the whole power equation, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, the U.S. had at first used it on Japan. Huge advantage. But the Soviets tested their own bomb by 1949. This started the nuclear arms race. Led to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. Both sides knew a nuclear war would destroy both of them. Paradoxically, this prevented direct war between them, but created constant global tension.
How did this new superpower setup influence decolonization? Why did empires crumble then?
Well, WWI weakened empires, but WWI devastated them. Britain, France, they were broke, exhausted. Couldn't afford to hold on to colonies anymore, especially with anti-colonial movements growing stronger. The hypocrisy of fighting for freedom against Hitler while denying it to colonies became obvious. Plus, both the US and USSR, for different reasons, sometimes rhetorically supported self-determination, though often tried to influence new nations. Perfect storm for independence. Result: about 80 new independent states emerge after 1945. Huge shift.
Let's define the Cold War itself, this long standoff. What was it fundamentally about?
It was this intense rivalry, ideological, political, economic, military between the U.S., leading the capitalist democratic bloc, and the USSR, leading the communist authoritarian bloc. Lasted roughly 45 years, from the late 1940s to 1991. Called cold because they never fought each other directly.
What was the core conflict? Just power politics, or was ideology really central?
Ideology was absolutely central. Completely opposing views on how society should be organized. U.S. free markets, individual liberty, democracy. USSR state control, collective ownership, one-party rule. Both believed their system was superior and destined to prevail globally. Made compromise almost impossible. A fundamental clash of worldviews.
And this led to deep suspicion and division.
Massive mistrust. Grew out of broken promises after WWII, especially Stalin installing communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating a Soviet buffer zone. Violated agreements about free elections. Churchill famously called this the Iron Curtain descending across Europe, symbolized the rigid ideological and political division of the continent, and soon, the world.
How did the newly independent nations fit into this? Were they forced to choose sides?
They were often pressured intensely. Both superpowers wanted allies, influence, strategic locations. Many new nations became pawns in the Cold War game, which leads to the question, how did they try to resist this pressure?
The non-aligned movement, that was their attempt to stay independent.
Exactly. Founded in 1955, the non-aligned movement brought together leaders from newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. India, Ghana, Egypt, Indonesia were key players. They declared neutrality, refused to formally align with either the U.S. or the USSR, tried to forge their own path, focus on development. Sometimes they skillfully played the superpowers off against each other to get aid, but the goal was to avoid being dominated.
What were the tangible results of this superpower rivalry? How did it shape global politics?
Led to new opposing military alliances. The Soviet bloc formed the Warsaw Pact. The U.S. and its allies formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Collective defense pacts facing off against each other fuel the insane nuclear arms race. Both sides build thousands of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the world many times over. M.A. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was terrifyingly close to actual nuclear war. Led to some arms control treaties later, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And since they couldn't fight directly, they fought through proxy wars.
Precisely. They backed opposing sides in regional conflicts all over the world. Fought indirectly. Key examples: the Korean War, US-UN versus North Korea-China. The Vietnam War, US versus North Vietnam-Viet Cong, backed by USSR-China. The Angolan Civil War, the Contra War in Nicaragua. These local conflicts became brutal Cold War battlegrounds, causing immense suffering.
China going communist in 1949 was a huge deal, right? How did that happen, and what were the immediate results under Mao?
Massive deal. After WWII, the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists, KMT, and communists, CCP, under Mao Zedong resumed. The communists won in 1949, established the People's Republic of China. Huge victory for the communist bloc. Mao immediately implemented radical changes. Land redistribution, took land from landlords and gave it to peasants, very popular initially. Then came the Great Leap Forward, 1958-62, an attempt at rapid, forced industrialization and collectivization of agriculture. Disaster. Led to terrible famine, killed maybe 20-50 million people. Later, China split from the Soviet Union, the Sino-Soviet split, developing its own brand of communism.
Were other new nations trying similar radical economic changes? Land reform, state control?
Yes. Many newly independent states experimented with socialist ideas or state-led development to break free from colonial economic patterns. In Africa, Nasser in Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Ethiopia became socialist under Mengistu. In Asia, Vietnam redistributed land under Ho Chi Minh. India, under Indira Gandhi, used five-year plans, state-owned industries. In Latin America, Castro's Cuba had radical land reform after the 1959 revolution, led to U.S. opposition, pushed Cuba towards the USSR, a global trend of seeking economic alternatives.
Okay, back to decolonization itself. How did colonies actually get independent? Was it always peaceful negotiation?
It varied hugely. Nationalist leaders pushed, but the process differed. Sometimes negotiated independence, mostly peaceful. India from Britain in 1947 after Gandhi's decades of nonviolent struggle. Ghana, Gold Coast from Britain in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah. Many French West African colonies negotiated independence too, but often it involved armed conflict and violent independence. Algeria's war against France was incredibly bloody. Angola fought Portugal, Vietnam fought France, then the U.S. Independence often came at a high cost.
And those artificial colonial borders created problems afterwards.
Huge problems. Imperial powers drew lines on maps, ignoring who actually lived there. Ethnic groups, religions, led to immediate conflict. The partition of India created Pakistan, caused massive violence between Hindus and Muslims, maybe 1 million killed, millions displaced. The creation of Israel and British Mandate Palestine led to immediate war and ongoing conflict. Nigeria had the Biafra Secessionist War, the Quebecois separatist movement in Canada. The legacy of those arbitrary borders is still felt today.
So these 80-odd new states appear. What impact did they have? What challenges did they face?
Huge impact on the UN, changing the balance of power there. Faced immense challenges. Building national unity across diverse groups divided by those colonial borders. Developing economies often dependent on exporting just one or two things, dealing with Cold War pressures. New governments often took strong roles in the economy. Nasser in Egypt, Indira Gandhi in India trying to build self-sufficiency. And interestingly, even after independence, migration often continued from former colonies to the former colonizers, maintaining cultural ties but also creating more diverse societies in Britain, France, etc. Complex post-colonial relationships.
Even with new states, people still resisted power structures, right? What kinds of resistance did we see in the 20th century beyond just anti-colonialism?
Lots of forms, both nonviolent and violent. Nonviolent resistance became incredibly powerful. Think Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. leading the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, though the ANC also had an armed wing, using civil disobedience, boycotts, marches to achieve major political change. But you also saw violent resistance and brutal state repression, military coups and dictatorships often backed by Cold War powers. Pinochet in Chile, Franco in Spain, Idi Amin in Uganda, using violence to crush opposition.
And the military-industrial complex became a factor.
Yeah, Eisenhower warned about it. The Cold War arms race created this powerful network of defense industries, military leaders, politicians, all with an interest in continued high military spending, made peace harder, arguably fueled conflicts indirectly.
And terrorism emerged as a new kind of global threat.
Yes, particularly towards the end of the century. Groups using violence against civilians for political aims, the Shining Path in Peru, Al-Qaeda, founded by bin Laden, waging global jihad, culminating in the 9/11 attacks, changed global security dramatically.
Yeah. Finally, the Cold War ends. Suddenly. How did the Soviet Union collapse? What brought it down?
Combination of things, really. U.S. pressure. Reagan's military buildup, the Star Wars missile defense idea, put pressure on the struggling Soviet economy. Soviet problems. The disastrous Soviet-Afghan War, their Vietnam, was a huge drain. Their economy was stagnating, couldn't keep up technologically or provide consumer goods. Gorbachev's reforms, his policies of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were intended to save the system, but they opened the floodgates to criticism and revealed how bad things were. He also stopped propping up communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Popular pressure. Once the fear lessened, people demanded change. Eastern European countries peacefully overthrew communism, symbolized by the Berlin Wall falling in 1989. Soviet republics started declaring independence. It unraveled fast. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Cold War over. Huge turning point.
And that brings us pretty much up to the present. Unit 9, Globalization. The world getting smaller, faster, more connected than ever. What does that mean, and how has technology driven it?
Yeah, globalization is this ongoing process, accelerating massively in the late 20th, early 21st century, where trade, tech, communication, culture just weave the world together more tightly, driven overwhelmingly by new technologies that conquer distance and time. Understanding tech's role is key here.
Communication tech seems huge. Radio, TV, phones, internet.
Absolutely transformative. Radio let leaders speak to millions. Television brought global events, even wars, into living rooms. Cellular phones, untethered communication. And the internet just revolutionized everything. Instant global communication, e-commerce, information access fundamentally changed how we interact.
And transportation kept getting faster, too.
Automobiles changed cities and lifestyles. Air travel became common, making global travel possible for many. And maybe the unsung hero, shipping containers. Standardized boxes that dramatically cut the cost and time of shipping goods globally. Make complex global supply chains possible, fueled offshoring. Huge economic impact.
What other big tech advances shaped this era? Energy, medicine.
Big advances in energy, petroleum, nuclear power-fueled industrial growth, medical innovations like antibiotics, penicillin, and vaccines massively increased lifespans worldwide. Birth control, like the pill, gave women more control, impacting demographics and social roles. And the Green Revolution, high-yield crops, fertilizers massively increased food production, feeding a growing world population, though with environmental costs.
So, better medicine, longer lives. But tech also helped diseases spread faster, right?
Exactly, a double-edged sword. Diseases linked to poverty still persist, where access to tech is limited. Malaria, TB, cholera. But global travel means new diseases can spread incredibly fast, becoming epidemics or pandemics.
Like the 1918 Spanish flu or HIV/AIDS or recently COVID-19.
Precisely. The 1918 flu killed tens of millions. HIV/AIDS emerged as a global crisis. COVID-19 shut down the world, spurred rapid vaccine development, shows our interconnected vulnerability. And in richer countries, longer lifespans mean more diseases of aging heart disease. Alzheimer's become the main health challenges.
And all this industry and population growth has had a huge environmental impact, leading to big global debates.
Massive impact. Widespread deforestation for farming in cities, desertification as land degrades. Air and water pollution became huge problems. Growing competition over scarce fresh water.
And the biggest one, climate change.
Yeah, the release of greenhouse gases, mostly from burning fossil fuels, is causing global warming. The science is clear on the warming. The debate is often about the causes, human versus natural cycles, and crucially, about responsibility. Big tension between developed nations who cause most historical emissions and developing nations who want to industrialize now. Who should pay? How do we transition fairly? Huge global challenge.
How did the global economy change after the Cold War ended? Seems like free markets became the dominant idea.
Largely, yes. The collapse of communism seemed to validate capitalism. Many governments embraced free market policies, sometimes called neoliberalism, lowering trade barriers, deregulation, privatizing state industries.
Who are the big proponents of this?
Leaders like Reagan in the U.S., Thatcher in the U.K. really pushed it. But also Deng Xiaoping in China, opening up their economy dramatically while keeping political control. Even authoritarian figures like Pinochet in Chile implemented radical free market reforms, spread worldwide.
How did the actual work change? Where are things made now?
Big shift in the global division of labor. Manufacturing increasingly moved to developing countries with lower wages. China became the world's factory, also Southeast Asia, Latin America. Wealthier countries focus more on knowledge economies, tech, finance, services. Think Silicon Valley, London, Tokyo. Creates new kinds of inequality.
How is this global economy managed? Are there global rules?
There are institutions. The World Trade Organization, WTO, sets trade rules. Regional blocs like the European Union, EU, NAFTA, now USMCA. ASEAN create free trade zones. And powerful multinational corporations, MNCs, operate globally, driving a lot of this integration.
With all this economic globalization, what about human rights, social justice? Were there movements pushing back or demanding change?
Definitely. Globalization also spread ideas about rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, set a global standard. Organizations like UNICEF focus on children's rights. Huge pushes for women's rights, globally voting, education, reproductive rights. CEDAW Convention. Cultural movements like Negritude celebrated Black identity. Liberation theology in Latin America applied Christian principles to fight poverty.
And progress on racial equality, too.
Significant progress. The Civil Rights Act in the U.S., the end of apartheid in South Africa, with Mandela becoming president, India's caste reservation system. Major victories against legal discrimination, though challenges remain.
But globalization itself faced protests against corporations, inequality.
Yes. Growing environmental protests, Greenpeace, and major economic protests against the perceived negative effects of globalization's sweatshops, environmental damage by MNCs, the policies of the World Bank and IMF seen as favoring rich countries. The Battle of Seattle against the WTO in 1999 was a big moment for this anti-globalization movement.
How has globalization affected culture? Are we all becoming the same?
It's complex. Communication tech spreads culture faster than ever. Global music, reggae, K-pop, global movies, Hollywood, Bollywood, social media connecting billions instantly. Global sports like the Olympics, World Cup, creates a shared global experience in some ways.
And consumer culture seems global too.
Very much so, driven by advertising and MNCs. Brands like McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Toyota are everywhere. Online shopping, Alibaba, Amazon, makes global products accessible, creates a sort of global consumer identity.
But is there resistance? Do cultures push back against this?
Yes, strong resistance too. Some countries try to protect local culture, limit foreign influence. China banning Facebook, Twitter, and promoting its own platforms is a prime example of trying to control cultural and information flows. It raises that big question. Can local cultures survive and thrive in this hyper-connected world, or does globalization inevitably lead to homogenization?
Finally, with the world so interconnected, dealing with global problems requires global cooperation. What institutions emerged to try and manage this?
We needed supranational organizations. The biggest is the United Nations, UN, created right after WWII to prevent another world war and foster cooperation. Learned lessons from the failed League of Nations.
What are the main parts of the UN? How does it work?
Key parts. The General Assembly, where almost all countries have a seat, discusses issues, passes resolutions, runs agencies like UNICEF, WHO, became more important as decolonized nations joined. The Security Council is supposed to maintain peace and security, has 5 permanent members with veto power, US, Russia, China, UK, France, and 10 rotating members. The veto often causes gridlock, but it can authorize peacekeeping missions or impose sanctions.
So the UN effective, flawed. What's the takeaway?
Both, really. It's a product of globalization, and it helps drive further cooperation. It's flawed because national interests often clash, especially with the veto power. But it remains the crucial forum for global diplomacy, coordinating humanitarian aid, addressing global challenges. It's our main attempt at global governance, however imperfect. #Atrocities.
Wow, okay. That was a whirlwind. Centuries of global history, from empires rising and falling, trade routes connecting people, revolutions changing everything, world wars, and now this intense globalization. We covered a lot of ground fast. Hopefully that gives you that big picture framework, especially if you're cramming right now.
Exactly. And the key is seeing the connections, right? How those early trade routes didn't just move silk, they moved the plague in Buddhism. How Enlightenment ideas fueled revolutions and anti-slavery movements. How industrialization led directly to imperialism. It's all interwoven. You can really trace the roots of today's world back through these major shifts we discussed.
So for you, the learner heading into that exam, remember, it's not just memorizing facts. It's about grasping these huge shifts, local to global power, muscle power to fossil fuels, national issues to global challenges, understanding the story, the cause and effect. That's what matters.
Precisely. And maybe that leaves you with a final thought to chew on. As our world gets even more connected, technology accelerates even faster, and challenges like climate change become even more urgent. What patterns from this long history are we repeating? And what lessons, maybe learned the hard way over the past 800 years, can actually help us navigate what comes next?
A really powerful thought. Okay, thanks for joining us on this super deep dive. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep learning.